hello, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. I'm not sure if I've used that one before. I'm pretty sure I've used that one before. I'm going to have to start writing these down. I'm running out of ideas now. What else could we go with? Flat earthers and globular earthers, maybe? Oh, I know. Registered and non-registered voters. That's what we'll go with. We've got a general election going on over here in the UK on the 8th of June. And what is it today? Today's the 20th of May. You've got till the 22nd, that's Monday, to get registered to vote. Nothing worse than someone pissing and moaning about the result when they didn't even vote. So, crack on. Anyway, where am I up to? Oh, yeah, I'm Danny, by the way, Danny Whittaker. This is My Own Worst Enemy, mental health podcast. Right, okay. As the title of today's show would suggest, the topic of today's discussion is suicide. And my guest today is Professor Rory O'Connor. Rory is Chair in Health Psychology and Head of Mental Health and Wellbeing at Glasgow University, where he also leads the Suicide Behaviour Research Lab, which is the leading suicide and self-harm research group in Scotland. He is co-editor of the International Handbook of Suicide Prevention, Deputy Chief Editor of the Archives of Suicide Research, and an Associate Editor of Suicide and Life-Threatening Behaviour, as well as serving on the Scientific Review Board of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. He also sits on the Scottish Government's National Suicide and Self-Harm Implementation and Monitoring Group. Now, before we get started, a bit of a confession I wish I didn't have to make, because it exposes my amateur podcasting skills. So this interview is actually recorded in two parts. We first did an hour back in February, but it was kind of quite clear that an hour wasn't going to be enough time, so we decided to book a second session later on. However, in the meantime, I listened back to the original conversation we had and realised there was loads of questions that I'd missed out. So when it came to sitting down for the second session, it wasn't just going to be a case of carrying on where we left off. We had to kind of go back and flesh things out a little further. And then it was kind of up to me to splice everything together and make it all coherent sounding during the editing process. Now, that would have been fine and gone completely undetected had it not been for the fact that when we sat down for this second sitting, I was in the midst of man flu, had a sore throat, and basically my voice sounded completely different from the first time. So when I first spliced these two separate conversations together, it basically sounded like Rory was being interviewed by two people, me and then some other random bloke who sounded eerily similar to me, but slightly more rugged. So I've had to kind of fiddle about with the sound and stuff the best I can to try and make both me's sound the same. And it's been a nightmare. I was actually supposed to post this episode yesterday, but it's taken me that long messing about with the sound to try and make it all sound seamless. And my laptop as well is basically an antique, which makes everything take 10 times longer. And I don't actually have a clue about sound engineering and editing, really, any of that. So it's been a bit like a monkey doing brain surgery with like a chewed lollipop stick and a pair of garden shears. I think I've done okay. I've been over it, and yeah, but if you can spot the discrepancies, treat me like you would like a 4-year-old doing a magic trick. So despite the blatant mistakes, just humour me and pretend like you haven't noticed them. I'm not the important half of this conversation anyway, so you can ignore me altogether if you like. I don't suppose it'll make much difference. Anyway, in today's conversation, we explore some of the common myths around suicide, why men are 3 times more likely than women to die by suicide. We discuss the role and responsibility of the media when it comes to reporting on this particular issue. We explore the development of Rory's theory of suicidal behaviour and his mission to discover what separates the few people who do die by suicide from the vast majority who don't. We discuss the effectiveness of suicide awareness campaigns, why suicide should never be dismissed as a cop-out or just attention seeking, And we also spend a good deal of time exploring some practical advice for people and the friends and relatives of those people who are themselves feeling suicidal. If you'd like to, before I forget, the middle third of our conversation very much revolves around what's known as the IMV model of suicidal behaviour, which is basically a theory of suicide that Rory's developed. And even though he explains it nice and clearly during the interview, you might find it easier to follow along if you have the diagram of the model itself in front of you. So if you want to bring that up, just go to myownworstenemy.org/podcast. That's right there in the show notes. As I was going to say, if you'd like to follow Rory on Twitter, he's at Suicide Research. If you'd like to pay a visit to his website, that's suicideresearch.info. Loads of information on there if you want to go a little deeper on any of the topics we talk about today. If you enjoy this episode, please take a moment to share it on social media, especially this episode. I think it's a particularly poignant one. And that's enough preamble, methinks. So, as always, please enjoy my conversation with Professor Rory O'Connor. Right, okay, we're on air. Rory O'Connor, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Danny.
Wow, okay, big one this today. Kind of a very serious topic, I suppose. We're talking about suicide. But before I get into that, as I've introduced this, I've said, very, very kind of serious topic we're getting into today. I really don't want to come at it from that particular angle. So for me, the whole thing with this podcast is to just sit down and talk about things openly. So in the same way that, the same way that you and your colleagues might do. I mean, I know this is a topic you deal with on a daily basis, and I don't suppose that every time you guys get together to discuss things, it's all very morbid and serious. So I'd like to kind of stick with that. Firstly, though, if you wouldn't mind telling me a little bit about yourself, your trajectory, how you got into psychology, and in particular this particular subject as well, if you could.
Sure. So I've been working in the area of suicide and self-harm since the mid-1990s. And how I got into suicide and self-harm in many ways was serendipitous. But as an undergraduate psychologist at Queen's University in Belfast in the early 1990s, as part of my final year dissertation, I was doing work on the whole notion of helplessness and hopelessness. And at that stage, it was really linked to depression. And I did an experimental study looking at the way people explain events in their lives and how they are linked to your mood. And that really interested me in the idea of looking at how thoughts interact with the way you think or the way you feel, and how the way you feel then has obviously a direct impact on your mood and well-being more generally. And so when I finished doing that project, I was really keen to do more research. So I was caught by the sort of research. I don't know. I fell in love with research then, and thought I would really like to make this a career. And the obvious way then to continue doing research was to investigate whether I could do a PhD in psychology. And the whole idea of psychology in general has always fascinated me, because I met a psychologist when I was 11. I was really intrigued and fascinated by what a psychologist could do. And then, as I say, the research bit of psychology really fascinated me as an 18, 19-year-old when I was doing my undergraduate degree. And then it just so happened that I applied then to do a PhD at Belfast, at Queen's in Belfast, really extending some of the work I did as an undergraduate. But then, as it happens, I didn't get funding to do that particular project. And I remember that during the summer months when I was just finishing my undergraduate degree, the person who turned out to be my research supervisor, he contacted me out of the blue and said, there might be funding to do a research PhD on suicide, but actually on suicide in prisons. And I said, well, that's an obvious thing I might be interested in because of my previous undergraduate work on hopelessness. So I said, yeah. So I started reading up on suicide in general and suicide in prisons in particular. And then as it happened, that funding opportunity didn't come off, it fell through. But I was then so intrigued by the whole area of suicide and self-harm that my supervisor, Noel, agreed then to continue to supervise me. And the university then gave me a scholarship to do a PhD focusing in on suicide. And so that was really in 1994, and I've been doing the research in that area ever since. And albeit that initially when I started working in this field, nobody close to me had killed themselves. The sad reality then really is in the intervening years, in the last few years, I've lost a really incredibly close female friend, a good colleague, and one of my best friends really to suicide. And then also the person who got me involved in the research into suicide in the first place, he also took his own life. So albeit that I've always been incredibly passionate about working in the area ever since I was 18, 19, 20, but then more recently, as I say, since my 30s, when I've been directly affected by suicide, that really has given me even more impetus to continue going. It's such an important topic. And I think the personal impact on me, it made me feel and still makes me feel a bit of a failure in many ways because I couldn't save their lives, but also illustrates to me the scale of the challenge of suicide prevention. That not only are you trying to identify which individual who's vulnerable, but we often talk in suicide about it's been coined by a famous suicidologist in the United States, this notion about death day. So it's this idea that not only are you trying to predict who will kill themselves, but you're also trying to predict when they'll kill themselves. And that's incredibly, incredibly difficult. So that's a sort of summary really then of how I got into the field. And as I say, I've been working in this area then ever since. And I moved to Scotland then in 1997 and set up my own research group on suicide and self-harm. And obviously now at Glasgow, I lead the Suicidal Behaviour Research Laboratory. And that's really a combination of, we've got postgraduate students, master's students, doctorate students, PhD students more generally, as well as research staff. And we work on a whole range of different projects. But what's common to each of them is we're trying to better understand the phenomenon of suicide and self-harm. From a compassionate viewpoint, obviously, it's such an important area. And then hopefully through that understanding, help people who are vulnerable so they can tackle this challenge of over 800,000 people every year dying by suicide in the world.
Okay, Rory, I have to ask, you said just then at the beginning that you met a psychologist at 11 and that you were fascinated by it. So, before we kind of move on and get into the thick of it, I'm curious, who was this psychologist and what was it that fascinated you? 'Cause it seems quite a precocious interest to have, because when I was 11, I wanted to be a Power Ranger, the red one specifically. So,
well, a Power Ranger, that's good to know. No, there's nothing. It's just really I came across, it was in a school context. There was a clinical psychologist who I met, and I'd never really thought about psychology before then. And he was talking about IQ and emotional well-being and health and stuff. And really that just really got me interested because I hadn't thought about it before then.
Right, okay. So before we get into the actual meat of it now, I think it's probably important to establish some definitions and parameters. The first one being, I know there's a bit of a debate around the actual term of committing suicide. Some people don't really agree with that term because I think that it's almost like there's the implication that it's some sort of like a criminal act.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested what your preference is for the terminology we're going to use moving forwards.
Well, the first thing to say with regard to the terminology is that words do matter. And it's, in our experience, speaking to people who are directly affected by suicide, either both people who've been suicidal themselves as well as those who have lost loved ones, in our sense of working in the field is a consensus is that people don't like the term committing suicide. And that's for a number of different reasons. One is, yes, it has this link to the fact that it used to be a criminal offence in the United Kingdom and no longer is. but people just find it offensive and find it's difficult for them. They're dealing with enough, and having to worry about the terminology is another difficult bit that they don't need to, or they don't want to have to deal with. So when I talk about suicide, I talk about people who died by suicide, people who lost their own life, people who took their own lives, and I try not to say committing suicide.
Okay, so I mean, the one that's going to kind of slip off the tongue the easiest for me, I think, is somebody taking their own life.
Yeah.
If you're fine with that, we'll move forward with that.
That sounds good.
And obviously just the word suicide in isolation as well, but we'll get rid of the word committing.
It's just committing is the only one I find offensive.
Right, okay. So the next thing to establish is what kind of suicide is worth discussing in the context of this, like a mental health podcast, because there are things like assisted suicide, euthanasia, there's parasuicide, which I think is probably worth defining for people if they're not familiar with that. With things like with assisted suicide, I'm wondering whether that's a separate discussion, because you're dealing with somebody usually that's got a terminal illness rather than somebody that's dealing with depression. But I'd rather throw that over to you and you tell me which ones are worth discussing within this particular context.
Well, I suppose they're both important topics, but in terms of the research that we do, all the work that we've been doing is looking at suicide in the context of mental health problems or stress, and just not assisted suicide. So I suppose my conversation today will be focused on the first definition of suicide. Right,
okay. So that would be excluding people that are taking their own lives due to things like terminal illness.
Well, yeah, yes. I mean, in some of the studies we do, that some of those individuals are in those studies, but in general, the notion of assisted suicide, euthanasia, I think, is a different discussion.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'd be more in the context of suicide, in the context of mental health problems, or just can't manage with life stress. But I mean, it doesn't exclude people with physical health problems who try and kill themselves or do kill themselves as well. But I think it's not. I mean, I suppose the broader debate of assisted suicide, I think, is beyond the scope of certainly of the work that we do.
Right. Okay. So what about this concept of parasuicide as well? Do you mind explaining what that is, and then again saying whether that's something that falls within your research?
Yeah. Well, parasuicide is a historic term. It was coined in the 1970s by a Scottish psychiatrist, or a psychiatrist who lived in Scotland, Norman Kreitman. And he was trying to tackle this really difficult issue, which we still have today, which is determining somebody's intent to die. So, for example, in the studies that we do with people who are admitted to hospital, we will ask them whether they intended to kill themselves. And some people will say yes, some people will say no, and a lot of people will say, I don't know, or I was ambivalent. And so there's a lot of often uncertainty around the intention to kill yourselves. And so the term parasuicide was really trying to capture the behaviour, talk about the fact that in the hospital context, most commonly people will present to hospitals with an overdose, and that it is very difficult to determine intention. So if it's very difficult to determine intention, the term parasuicide was trying to describe it as a behaviour and make no reference at all to the person's intention, but recognise the fact that actually it could have ended in death without intervention, but we don't know what the individual's intent was. Now, more recently, people really don't talk about parasuicide anymore. As I say, it's a term which was still being used in the 1990s, certainly when I started work in this area, but it's not one we use now. And in the UK context, we tend to talk about self-harm. And indeed, if you look at the clinical guidelines that the NHS use, they use self-harm. And again, self-harm is any form of self-inflicted injury, which again could have led to death, but it doesn't make a direct reference to an individual's intent. Right,
okay. The next thing, doing a lot of kind of sweeping the board here before we get going, but again, very worthwhile, I think, is to kind of deal with some common myths about suicide, because then, once they're dealt with, I can kind of, instead of running into these later on down the line, I wonder if you could just run through some common myths about suicide that we can immediately dismiss before we get into the thick of it.
Well, there are a number of common myths out there. So one is that suicide occurs without warning or happens without warning. And indeed that sometimes is the case, but often there are warning signs if we knew about them. But the challenge is knowing the warning signs in advance. A second myth is that people who engage in non-fatal suicidal behaviour, which is looks like it's low in lethality, that they didn't really mean to kill themselves. Again, that's not true. We should always take all forms of suicide attempt, irrespective of potential lethality, seriously. The other myths include that suicide itself is inherited. I mean, it's not inherited. I agree that there are some vulnerability factors. We know some mental health problems have a genetic component, but it's very difficult to say that suicide is inherited. There's risk factors are inherited, but not itself. Not suicide itself would be my argument. That's a myth. Suicide occurs only in certain groups of people from certain backgrounds. And again, that's a myth that suicide can affect people from any social class. Now, it does tend to be the case that people from more disadvantaged backgrounds kill themselves, but it does affect people across, as I say, the socioeconomic spectrum. Suicide, well, there are myths would be out there. All suicides occur in the context of mental illness or mental health problems. Again, that's not strictly true, albeit that we know that in Western countries, like the UK, the overwhelming majority of people who die by suicide, it does happen in the context of mental health problems, but not in all cases. And indeed, if you look then in Eastern countries like Asia or China in particular, the rate of mental illness which is associated with suicide is much lower. So they're just a handful. The other one is all suicide attempts or self-harm is attention-seeking. We should never treat it as attention-seeking. It's trying to draw attention to somebody's distress, but we should never think about it in this pejorative sense of, it's only attention-seeking. All suicide attempts, all self-harm needs to be taken seriously and treated with compassion and respect.
Right, okay. So I think some of those latter points are kind of the perfect segue into the epidemiology of suicide. I'm interested first, though, when you say that suicide doesn't always happen within the context of mental health, what, especially like in Eastern cultures, what are the other causes there?
Well, it could be the response to stress, that somebody has encountered something awful in their life, and they see no other way out. They see no alternative. So I think we'll be moving on at some stage to talk about my model, the IMV model. But so they see suicide as the only solution to their problems. So that's not mental illness or mental health problems per se. They don't have a diagnosable disorder, but that for whatever circumstances or set of reasons, they see no other option.
Right.
Or it could be the case of people, if you lost your partner, your long-term partner, you can see no alternative. If you're an older adult, say, you think, well, I'll just kill myself because I have no reasons for living. Now, it's important to point out that suicide is rarely caused by one single event or factor. It is multifactorial. But I suppose the point is that you don't have to have a diagnosable mental illness to kill yourself, I suppose is the main point.
Right, got it. Okay, so when I was kind of digging through some of the facts and figures about it, you're talking about different age groups and gender, culture, things like that. So the finding I got was that it was generally most common in people over 70, which surprised me. Stop me if any of this isn't true, but generally most common in people over 70, most attempted by young people and females, particularly in the West, but most often completed by men.
Yeah, that's an accurate representation. If you look at the sort of broad brush world picture, yes, certainly even when I got sort of working in this field in the 1990s, it was older men were most likely to kill themselves. But now there's been a change. If we just focus in on in Europe for a second and the UK, it's no longer older men who are most likely to kill themselves. The biggest risk group for suicide in the UK and generally most European countries now is middle-aged men. And so that's an important transition. And indeed, again, when I started working in this area, it was, so in the mid-1990s, the biggest risk group of all was young men. So you had either ends. If you look at the historic data, it was either ends of the age spectrum historically were most at risk. But then what's been really interesting over the last 20 years is how those young men who were young men in the mid-1990s who were most likely to kill themselves, that age group seems to be carrying their risk of suicide with them into their mid-40s. So right. I'm now of that age, which is really high risk of suicide. And indeed, you're right also when you said about the gender difference, that in every country in the world, men outnumber women in terms of the number of suicides. But in the UK and Western countries, it tends to be about 3 times more men than women who will kill themselves. Wow.
Okay, right. There's a couple of things I kind of want to tackle there. Firstly is, so there seems to be like an intergenerational difference going on there, which is that due to a kind of a cultural shift that the generations before weren't feeling, and the generation now isn't feeling. But like you say, the generation of people that grew up in the 90s, there's a particular set of cultural things that are going on there that are causing this, because like you say, that it's something they've taken with them.
Yeah, well, this is still conjecture, because it's really difficult to investigate why this has happened. But yeah, part of it, so we talk about what's known as a cohort effect. So we think that the people who were young men in the mid-1990s, as I say, that cohort of people, there was something about being that age or growing up in the 60s and 70s and early 80s that made you more at risk by the time you got through young adulthood. And so one of the hunches are, at the time of growing up, when you're a young man in the mid-1990s, you experience a recession. The recession had just happened, and the impact of unemployment, on lack of prospects, may have been part of the puzzle, right? So that might be a risk factor, because we do know that suicide and unemployment are related. So we know that if you're unemployed, you're much more likely to try to kill yourself. But having said that, the converse is also true, is that, which makes it more complicated, is that albeit that unemployment is related to suicide, most people who kill themselves are in employment, they're working, just the way the statistics work. But still, unemployment is a risk factor. And also there could be issues around help seeking. So maybe you're less likely to seek help or find it more difficult to seek help. And there may be some cultural element there, which I still think persists. But I think the other big change might be the change in role of a man in society has changed markedly in the last 20 or 30 years. And that some sociologists talk about this idea of the buffer generation. And the buffer generation are effectively people in their 40s and 50s now who, when they look ahead to their fathers maybe were this sort of stiff upper lip, you didn't seek help for emotional problems, pull your socks up, that sort of idea. And then when they look behind them to their kids are much more comfortable with seeking help, talking about their emotions, and that they're caught in this buffer factor, this middle generation, of which you find it difficult, or men have found it difficult to transition into this new generation of what means to be a successful man.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So the next one was the disparity between men and women. So does that disparity exist as just attempted suicide, or is this completed suicide?
So in the people who die by suicide, yeah, in most Western countries, it's 3 times more men than women. And in attempted suicide, historically it was about the same, but in the reverse. So 3 times more females would attempt suicide than males. Now, the new data would suggest that more recently in the last few years, that's changing. In that for the attempted suicide, the male-female difference isn't as big as what it was, but females are still more likely to attempt suicide than men. An obvious reason might be, why is that the case? And again, that's a difficult question to answer. But one important factor is we do know that men tend to use more lethal methods of attempting suicide than women. And so that's part of the puzzle we're trying to understand better. But I think that's a definite issue, is that women in their attempt are much more likely to stay alive.
Without being gratuitous, but just being matter of fact about it, what are the methods that men and women tend to employ?
To be honest, I'm always very reluctant to talk about methods in a media context because we know that it confers risk. So sorry, Dan, I don't really want to answer that question just because there are media guidelines and we shouldn't really talk about the details of methods online. So suffice to say, though, it's more lethal methods for men, less lethal for women. So I'm sorry not to go into more detail.
No, that's fine, because it actually brings up a question that I did have a little bit further down the line to do with kind of media responsibility and this idea of the modelling phenomenon. Now, is that something worth talking about now that we've brought it up, or should it?
No, I think it's an important one. Talk about it now.
Okay.
I mean, it is a genuine risk. Is that we know that if suicide is glamorized in the media, if there's detailed descriptions of methods, if people make it seem a simplistic solution to life's problems, these are factors when they're portrayed in the media, we know are associated with increased risk of suicide. So the media, I think, have a difficult task because, and it doesn't matter what media, if you're talking about traditional media, like newspapers or radios or TV, or new media, it's difficult because I think it's really important that we talk about suicide and we talk about its complexity, but we have to do it in a way which is responsible. And that's why Samaritans, the National Union of Journalists, the International Association for Suicide Prevention, each of them have detailed media reporting guidelines. And those reporting guidelines are along the lines I've just said about not going into detail about methods and glamorization and so on. And that's because we do know that it increases the likelihood that somebody who's vulnerable out there may be more likely to attempt suicide if it's portrayed in these manners that we're trying to prevent.
Yeah, I mean, like a perfect example of that would be like rock stars, and it's very much the whole live fast, die young. It's the cool thing to do kind of thing. People like Kurt Cobain and Jimi Hendrix are kind of held up as heroes for kind of going out that way, which is very peculiar.
But I suppose the balance is I suppose it's important that it's not about censorship, because some people say, you're censoring. We're not censoring. It's about saying, here's best practice. We want to report suicide, but it has to be done, has to be in a responsible fashion.
Well, that's it, because, I mean, there does seem to be this modelling phenomenon. A better way of putting it would be there is this phenomenon of copycat incidents that's kind of that's an actual proven phenomenon. So when people do talk about this stuff in the media, then I think there was quite a famous case in the Philippines with a pop star, and then that resulted in a lot of copycat incidents from a lot of young people not too long after that. So yeah, super important to mention. It's something I didn't spot, even though I'd got it in my own questioning. So I'm glad you pulled me up on it. So.
No, I wasn't pulling you up. But the important thing to note, though, is it's not just on celebrity suicides; it's in any suicide. It'd be really so. Yeah, the celebrity ones are the ones we hear about, but the media reporting it applies to reporting of all suicides, and I think that's an important message.
Right. Okay. So the next step now is to move into the whys, and this brings us to your IMV model of suicide. So if you kind of just give a brief summary of what that is, and then we'll kind of work our way through it.
Okay. So a good way to begin is maybe say a bit of a rationale of why I developed it. And so a really important message is that there are many, many risk factors for suicide. And the most commonly reported and the most commonly researched risk factor is mental health problems or mental illness. And we know that in Western countries, about 90% of people who die by suicide have a history of some mental health problem. And it's most commonly depression. But then the interesting sort of issue around depression or mental health problems is, albeit they're really important risk factors, they're not particularly good at helping us identify who is most at risk. So to make this point, we focus in on depression, which everybody agrees is an important risk factor. The overwhelming majority of people with depression don't kill themselves. And indeed, it's less than 5% of people who've been treated for depression kill themselves. So for me, the question was always, okay, so yes, I think mental health problems are important because that's a context in which suicide often occurs. But for me, it was, how can I better identify that 5%? The 5% who kill themselves, how are they the same or different from the 95% who don't? And that was sort of the broad premise that led me to think we need to look at more specific markers or more specific risk factors. And so being a psychologist and the work that we've been doing for the previous 15 years or so was we were trying to understand the suicidal mind. And that led me then to look at different theories of why people kill themselves, different psychological factors. And then I basically, in 2011, tried to put this all together and really into my thinking about why I thought people killed themselves. So the brief overview then of the model, it's a 3-phase model. It's in 3 parts. And the first part, which is on sort of, when you see it diagrammatically, it's on the left-hand side.
Yeah, I will. Sorry, just to note, Rory, I will include a link in the show notes for people to actually go and find this diagram so they can look at this while you actually run through it. So,
okay, great. So, well, I'll assume people are looking at the model when I'm talking about it, just so it makes it a bit easier. So, as I say, it's 3 parts. And the left-hand side is really just the context in which suicide occurs. So you'll see up there, there's a word called diathesis. And diathesis simply means vulnerability. And what it tries to understand or recognize is that we know people have biological vulnerabilities, these sort of genetic vulnerabilities, and they can have cognitive vulnerabilities. And what I mean by those sort of vulnerabilities is, for example, we know that low levels of serotonin are associated in the brain, are associated with increased risk of suicide. Now, low levels of serotonin are associated with a range of other things as well, but we know it's associated with people who attempt and die by suicide. But it's a vulnerability factor an individual brings. Or another one might be a sort of a personality type vulnerability factor, might be something like perfectionism. We do a lot of work on perfectionism, and particular types of perfectionism are associated with increased risk of suicidal behavior. And then the other 2 components of the left-hand bit, the pre-motivational phase, are we've got the negative life events, life stress. We know that people who die by suicide tend to experience a disproportionate number of negative life events. Now, that could be experiencing trauma early in life, or experiencing bullying, young person, or bullying, or loneliness, or bereavement, or abuse at any stage of your life. But we know that both in early adulthood and in childhood, there's an increased likelihood of experience of negative stressors, which we think are associated with suicidal risk. And then the last bit of that left-hand bit is disadvantage. We know that deprivation, doesn't matter how you describe it, people from more disadvantaged backgrounds are really much more likely to kill themselves compared to people who are not from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there, again, that adds to this wider context of vulnerability. So that's just the broad brush of the left-hand side. But then in terms of trying to understand the sort of psychological processes, the central portion of the model, the motivational phase, is trying to understand why suicidal thoughts emerge in some people and not in others. In a very straightforward way, or in a scientific way, we talk about a very parsimonious explanation is that we think you're much more likely to think about suicide or develop suicidal thoughts if you're feeling defeated or humiliated from which you cannot escape. So this sense of being trapped in humiliating and defeating circumstances. And then the argument is that if you experience defeat and entrapment at the same time, statistically, you're more likely to become suicidal. And then the other bits below defeat and entrapment are the really fundamental psychological processes that make it more likely that you, first of all, experience defeat, and then as you move from feeling defeated to feeling trapped, and then from feeling trapped to becoming suicidal. And again, if there's more information on our website at suicideresearch.info, which goes into more detail on those psychological processes that sort of are associated with defeat and associated with entrapment. And then the last bit in sort of the overview of the model is the third phase of the model, which is the volitional phase. And the volitional phase is trying to understand why is it that some people who actually think about suicide go further? And why is it that some people who think about suicide actually make that transition to making a suicide attempt or dying by suicide? So in essence, if you think about the model's three parts, the left-hand bit, if I was to describe that in one word, I would describe that as background. And then similarly with the central portion of the model, if it was using one word to describe that, it would be ideation. So in other words, thinking about suicide. And then similarly in the third bit of the model, if I was to describe that in one word, it would be action or attempt in the context of a suicide attempt or die by suicide. And then again, just to finish my overview, and then sorry, you can jump in, Danny, is that the transition from suicidal thoughts to suicidal attempts is governed by what or determined by what I talk about as volitional moderators. And what volitional moderators are a collection of factors, risk factors, that when present, make it more likely that you'll attempt suicide. So you make that final transition from thoughts to attempts. Right. So I want to kind of jump in here and be kind of full disclosure and why this is of interest to me. So in the early part of 2015, I think it was, I went through a period of what I consider suicidal ideation. It was only a very short period for about 2 weeks, very intense. And a bit of the background on that, just very, very briefly. I am going to cover this in detail at some point in a podcast of its own. The reason this model was very interesting for me is this middle bit, the motivational phase, it fitted perfectly into my the way I felt at the time. So I started a business in my early 20s and about 23 years old. And then I went bankrupt in 2008, so a long time ago. But it ate away at me for years and years and years, and I could never let it go. It was almost like, it's kind of like losing a family member. I just couldn't let it go. And very much attached to those, the feelings there for me were though defeat and humiliation. I felt very defeated for losing my business, but there was, I always say, I'm not sure very many people are actually familiar with the emotion of humiliation, because it's not the same as embarrassment. There's, it's a lot deeper. It really eats away at you than this idea that I was a failure and that everybody had seen it. Yeah. That really kind of ate away at me for a long time. And it was in attempting to rectify the situation, trying to, I always said I was going to start another business. I was going to come back from this. I was going to show everybody. And in those intervening years between 2008, 2015, I tried all kinds of little harebrained ideas and nothing really panned out for me. That led this consistent failure
that led to that sense of entrapment. Just, I'm never going to solve this. I'm never going to make up for this. I'm always going to be that the loser. And then it was when kind of towards the 2014-15 was when anxiety kind of crept in. And I think that was very much based in, like you was talking about, this perfectionism. Everything needed to be right. I had to be in control of every aspect of my life, even the people around me, and then it turned in on itself. I had to be in control of my own thoughts and the way I was thinking, and that became so intense for me that it got to a point where I've always thought that I never felt like I wanted to die. I felt like I wanted to want to die. Does that make sense? Because it always felt like if there was an off button, rather than, because I know the implications of going through with that, and I don't want to upset the people around me. But if there was just an off button that I could have just pressed, and it had just meant I'd have just disappeared and no one would have noticed, I'd have happily pressed that button.
Yeah, I mean, no, hang on, what you're saying. I mean, I've heard similar stories so often, and I think it's often difficult for people, obviously, around you to maybe understand what's going on in your head, in the same way that the intensity or the humiliation it's very difficult to sometimes put into words. But the idea about maybe not wanting to die, but wanting the off button, I think that's really, really interesting. And people often talk about the reason I want to kill myself is because I wanted the pain to end, or I wanted the thoughts to stop. And it's just that, when the out of controlness of the internal entrapment in your head, that's just becomes unbearable. So albeit yours maybe it's slightly different, and you just wanted to cease the thought, or turn the off button. I mean, it's so similar to what people report. So I think, it's a great way to put it, though, by turning. Like is the wrong word, but I can appreciate the off button idea.
Yeah, but the interesting part for me, Rory, especially looking back, is I'm super curious, and this is kind of the point we're at now with this, the transition between that second phase and the actual, the behavioural and action phases. That I was probably at a critical point there, and it's those factors that what didn't happen to me, why didn't that carry on? Because those are the factors that are obviously, if we can catch people in that moment, that's the time when we're most likely to help people. So I know you obviously can't, especially from such a brief summary, you can't say why I in particular didn't move forward, but what are the common factors or the personality traits or whatever it is that stop people going from ideation to suicidal behaviour?
So they're different things. So if you look at in the central bit of the model, and you've got defeat and entrapment and suicidal ideation in the center bit. If you look below that, you've got all these psychological processes which feed into each of the transitions from defeat to entrapment and entrapment to suicidal thinking. And so one of them, for example, we just focus in on is people who are feeling trapped. If they have lots of social support, for example, they're less likely to become suicidal. Or if you're feeling trapped, and so we've done a lot of work on the way people think about the future. And so there's simple things that when people become trapped or suicidal, they just can't think of anything positive, right? It's not that necessarily they're overwhelmed with negative thoughts and negativity, but it's this absence of the positive. So simple things that can be done are that you intervene to get people to try and identify even small positive things. And the identification of small positive things in some ways can break the cycle, that you do see a glimmer. Because remember, often suicide is described as in the context of tunnel vision. And this idea, you can't see alternatives. You can't see a solution. And suicide has been described as the ultimate attempt at solving your problems. So the intervention is just trying partly to get people to think alternatively, to help them to do that. But you also have to recognize, for some people, my God, their life is so awful And then in that case, it's maybe trying to help them manage the pain that they're experiencing, either physical or psychological pain, and maybe trying to focus on different things. So there are things that can be done. But the crucial thing for us as sort of researchers in particular, but also people if you're working clinically, is to keep people safe at that moment of crisis when they are feeling really trapped, is making sure as far as possible that they don't have the access to the means of suicide, or that they really know somebody they can speak to at the moment of absolute despair, that they can reach out to somebody. Because I think reaching out to somebody, it's a cliche, but a problem shared is not quite a problem halved, but certainly things seem a bit better if you're able to speak to somebody else.
Oh, totally. That was part of my problem. Is I didn't want to talk to anybody. It's embarrassing to talk to somebody. You've got to pull through. What sort of man are you? Can't pull through this on your own. Get over it, kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's the whole point about dealing with the male role and what it means to be a male. We need to be teaching our kids that, and it's never mind the idea that it's a weakness to seek help or to whatever reach out. It's the most strength. It's such an important strength to have. You have the strength of, I don't care. I will reach out and seek help because God Almighty can keep you alive. It's more manly, whatever manliness means. It's more manly in my view to seek help rather than just to bottle it up.
Yeah, just on this note of people feeling trapped, and I see. Especially like these self-help guru types on the blogs, they give kind of very, very kind of airy-fairy advice about, 5 things to do if you're feeling suicidal. And I think a lot of people think of suicide as a very, almost like not just a conscious choice, but a cop-out. That's the one I'm looking for. People think of it as a cop-out, that it's almost like a sign of weakness. You just can't handle the world or something like that. And there's this quote by the author David Foster Wallace. He's somebody who, it's speaking from experience, he took his own life in 2008, and he describes the feeling of being suicidal. And I think this is a really important quote that ever since I read it, I thought people need to read this and really understand what it feels like, because it's not just a cop-out. It's not just you being a wimp, you can't handle the world. And he described it as this, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts on it as well. So he said the so-called psychotically depressed person who tries to kill herself doesn't do so out of, quote, hopelessness or any abstract conviction that life's assets and debts do not square. And surely not because death seems suddenly appealing. The person in whom its invisible agony reaches a certain unendurable level will kill herself in the same way a trapped person will eventually jump from the window of a burning high-rise. Make no mistake about the people who leap from burning windows. Their terror of falling from a great height is still just as great as it would be for you or me standing speculatively at the same window, just checking out the view, i.e. the fear of falling remains a constant. The variable here is the other terror, the fire's flames. When the flames get close enough, falling to death becomes the slightly less terrible of 2 terrors. It's not desiring the fall, it's terror of the flames, and yet nobody down on the sidewalk looking up and yelling don't and hang on can understand the jump. Not really. You'd have to have personally been trapped and felt the flames to really understand a terror way beyond falling. To me, I like I say, personally never quite reached that, but it was certainly, it was like, to keep it analogous, the flames kind of lapping around the door, if you like. And I just wonder what you think of that perspective on it.
No, I think, don't know if it took it all in that one quick reading, but certainly, when I like the idea of the fact that that you have no option, and it's not as if somebody's decided, on a whim, I'm going to kill myself, and that's not the case. It's usually, most often, it's the case a person has just given up because they're overwhelmed and they just can't go on any longer. And I think that the idea of the fire and the flames and the comparing it to whatever the jumping out the window. I think that the people don't do this lightly, and indeed, the point you mentioned at the outset is, I hate this being described as like a number of things. I hate it being described as a selfish act. I hate it being described as a wimpish act, as a cowardly act, because to carry through in this act, it's just unimaginable in my mind. Unimaginable the pain that an individual is experiencing, or the trauma, or the sense of entrapment or distress that they have chosen. They can think there's nothing else they can do. The only option they can think of is to kill themselves.
Yeah.
So it's really important, and then adds to the stigma around suicide. Again, when we talk in these terms about, it's a wimpish, cowardly thing, it's most definitely not. And what we should be trying to understand is what the distress is like to that individual, that they're so blinkered in their vision often, they just have had enough. They're overwhelmed. They think often that they're doing their loved ones a favour, because they often feel a burden on others and they feel disconnected, that they see no other alternative. And I think it's just awful to think about what that person must have been going through. And it should never, ever be belittled by this notion about cowardice.
Yeah, well, that's this idea of it being a selfish act. I can totally relate to that. It's not like when you're in that place, you don't realise the consequences that it's going to have on your friends and family. It's not like you haven't thought of that or that you don't care, but it can almost be to the point where, again, I was never quite at that extreme, but I certainly felt like I was just a pain in the ass for everybody. Like I'm especially because I've got a little boy as well, and you get into the point where I'm very cognizant of the fact that your children, they learn from the parents, and like we were already talking about, your background and the way you're raised affects the way you're going to be in the world. And if I'm in this dark place where I feel like I can't really cope with life anymore, I don't want to instill that in my little boy. Do you know what I mean? I don't want him to raise him that way. And so, like you say, it's almost like you feel, if you did it, as much as you love these people and you know it'd hurt them, it's probably the lesser of two evils that you disappear.
Yeah, absolutely. But it highlights the complexity of it all. It's not. Yeah, these things are never straightforward, and you don't deliberately. A person who kills himself, and 9 times out of 10 is certainly not deliberately doing it to hurt the loved ones. Again, it's usually the opposite. They think that their loved ones would be better off without them.
Okay, so. Just sticking with this theme of the IMV model a little bit further, but also kind of taking a step back. I'm interested in, you said at the start of this that you, prior to developing this model, you went and did a lot of research and read up on all these other theories of suicide.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, what were those theories and what was it about them that you felt were lacking that kind of justified the development of a new theory?
Well, a couple of things. First, some of the early theories, for example, escape theory, I was really intrigued by that because I really liked the idea, or it really resonated with me, the idea of the importance of suicide being a response to being trapped. But the thing about the original escape theory put forward by Baumeister was it didn't really talk about the conditions under which somebody may develop suicidal thoughts or move from suicidal thinking to suicide attempts. So one of the things I was intrigued or really endeavoured to do then after that was to try and have a more comprehensive model. And indeed, probably with the exception of Thomas Joyner's model, there was nothing else out there really which looked at this transitional process from thinking about suicide and attempting suicide. And albeit I think Thomas's model I like as well, Thomas Joyner's model, I think what mine tries to do is get arguably a more detailed pathway through the development of suicidal thoughts through that transition to suicide attempts. And given that I was really thought that the whole idea of entrapment was so important, that's really why I had that as central to the model. So what I tried to do then was identify specific psychological processes like coping, like rumination, like goal setting, like belongingness and all these other factors, and look to see, well, how could they all come together to move us really from, and the purpose of the model, from the left-hand side of the model to the right-hand side. And what I tried to do was detail that in a sort of systematic way.
Speaking of theories, one of the theories that kind of intrigued me, which I've run into a few times, was suicide from a Darwinian perspective. Mm-hmm. And I guess on the two main ideas that I've kind of run into is, on the one hand, it's some people think that it's kind of once a person maybe loses their place or purpose in society, or the tribe, if you like, through things like injury, illness, rejection, then it makes evolutionary sense for that person to take their own lives as a way of preserving scarce resources for the tribe. And so that's where that drive comes from. And then on the other hand, there's people saying that actually suicide is it's like a byproduct of intelligence. It's it's the result of a brain that's so sophisticated that it can outsmart its own genetic will to survive. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, because I found it a really interesting concept.
Yeah, it's an interesting to think about it. I suppose the whole idea of the survival of the fittest notion that underpins evolution, obviously, arguably there could have some role here, but I suppose what I come back to time and again is, given that we know that social disadvantage, for example, is such a key risk factor for suicide. So my point would be that society has continually let down people who are disadvantaged. That I don't think is a fair comparison. The sort of Darwinian perspective is particularly helpful, because we know that if we provide support, even in temporary support, or we help those for a period of time who are vulnerable, that they get through it and they learn to thrive. So my view has always been that we should be doing more as a society to protect the vulnerable at the periods in which they're vulnerable, because that their contribution is just phenomenal thereafter. So I wouldn't be of this view that we should. It's about maintaining scarce resources, and it's so I had a more socially aware view of suicide.
Yeah, I just thought it was a very intriguing perspective. Just that idea that possibly you're being pushed to do it, and that's why the drive to end one's own life has got an evolutionary basis to it, is what makes it such a difficult thing to overcome. But anyway, moving on. I suppose the big question I've got about this developing a model, a theory, whatever about suicide is kind of to what end? Like, what's the practical application of modelling the process of suicide in this particular way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a number of reasons why a model is useful and helpful. One is that the person who's feeling vulnerable, the person who's feeling suicidal, it helps them understand why they're feeling the way they do. And that certainly that's especially this notion of people who are suicidal who maybe historically would have thought, oh, I'm mad and everybody's different from me and nobody else is feeling the way that I do. But this helps them understand, well, actually, often it can be an understandable response to lots of traumatic experiences. And that if we can put words to it, that's a starting point to help with understanding and processing what's going on, and then hopefully getting the help and support that they require. So that's obviously useful from the point of view of the person who's feeling suicidal, and also for the person who's hopefully trying to provide support or help for a person who's suicidal. Well, actually it provides a framework in which they can have a narrative and they could help to formulate, in sort of clinical psychology terms, formulate what's going on in that person's life to help understand, well, actually, what happened to you? Why do you feel the way you are? Rather than simply asking what's wrong with you. It's not about what's wrong with you, it's about understanding why a person is feeling so constricted, is feeling suicidal. So I think that's helpful, really, really helpful. And then the third thing, which I think is important to point out, is if you've got a theoretical model, you can first of all test it to see, well, actually, does it work? Does it make sense? And if it does work and it does make sense, you can then develop, hopefully, effective interventions to help those who are vulnerable.
Yeah, well, that's perfect segue, because that's what I wanted to kind of get onto now. One of the things I kind of noticed looking at the model was kind of the magnitude of the prevention effort changes as you go along it. So like in the pre-motivational phase, where you've got these kind of socioeconomic issues and these triggering events, it seems like it's big societal change that needs to take place there. In the motivational phase is where you're looking at things like therapy and like the National Health Service getting involved. And then in the volitional phase, it's very much removal of means and maybe the job of friends and relatives to intervene. So I guess with that in mind, what do you think is the most effective? And I mean, I know we've got to go to work probably on all three phases, but which do you feel is the phase that should be targeted, that'd be most effective to target, and by what means?
So that's a difficult question to answer. It depends who's asking the question in many respects. So I think you're right to highlight, or what you have highlighted is the fact that if you look at suicide prevention efforts across the world, you can divide them into two types. Big public health interventions like restricting access to the means of suicide. And then alongside that, you have targeted work with high-risk groups like people who have mental health problems or people who have attempted suicide in the past and so on. And you're right, at different phases of the model, there's differential focus on public health versus one-to-one or group level or more focused interventions. So in terms of, if the question is, if you're a politician, for example, who is really keen to intervene to reduce risk of suicide, it's arguable, but more likely that big public health interventions like restricting access to the means of suicide or big public health campaigns potentially have the best chance of being effective. In particular, restriction of access to the means of suicide. That's where probably the strongest evidence for suicide prevention efforts lies. Now, if you're a clinician or a family member or somebody who's suicidal, well, yeah, all the public health interventions are really, really important, but I want to help the person who's in crisis. And so that's where you then have the one-to-one work or the psychological therapies or the drug therapies or the combination or whatever it may be. But that's when you might try to relieve the person of their distress, make them feel less trapped or whatever it may be. So I don't see them as one or the other. It's important that we have both. And that overarching all of that is we need societal change so that people are more likely to seek help, that we destigmatize mental health problems, that we destigmatize the whole issue around suicide and its prevention, and that if we do all those things, they will impact on the suicide rate. But these will be long-term challenges. I mean, there's no short fix to preventing suicide.
One of the things I've run into repeatedly is people claiming that there's no good evidence that awareness campaigns actually reduce suicide. Seems to be a lot of skepticism around that. And that's pretty true, though. It is true.
The evidence for public health awareness campaigns preventing suicide itself is very, very limited. So, but that's partly because they're really, really difficult to do in terms of to evaluate them. Because remember, for you to identify or determine that something prevented suicide, you need these studies which involve thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. When we talk about statistical power, to have the statistical power to be able to identify whether it actually changes or reduces the suicide rate. So if we look at there's a campaign known as Defeat Depression campaign. It's the European Alliance for defeating depression. For some reason, I can't remember the name of it. But there's some evidence that they used a multi-level approach. And this multi-level suicide prevention approach, which included mental health awareness, as well as restriction of access to the means and a number of other things, there's some evidence in Germany that that was effective. So albeit that the evidence is pretty weak, I still think it's good to do, because we know that public health campaigns do change attitudes, and attitudes are one proxy factor which is important, say, in help seeking or whatever. So albeit we can't say for certain that these are positive for preventing suicide, I think they're in general not a bad thing to do.
But in terms of, say where funding is being allocated, do you think that like the awareness campaigns, do you think that hand's being overplayed? Possibly.
Well, it depends what the awareness is. So there is. So I'm speaking specifically about suicide.
Yeah.
There is evidence out there that public awareness campaigns do change people's attitudes towards mental health problems. And indeed, I know in Scotland, now, albeit we didn't formally assess it, that up until maybe 7 or 8 years ago, every 2 years, the Scottish government assessed attitudes towards mental health. And at the same time, as part of the suicide prevention campaign, there were public health awareness campaigns. And we could see over time that more and more people were aware of the public health campaigns about mental health and about suicide prevention. And there seemed to be some decrease in negative attitudes towards mental health. Now, although we cannot say that the public health campaigns led to a change in attitudes, they happened at the same time. There may be some association. So it's important that we don't throw the baby with the bathwater, and that we look at all potential approaches to preventing suicide, but look at other proxies like mental health attitudes or suicide attempts or self-harm, because it'll always be really difficult to determine or to demonstrate unequivocally that doing X led to a change in the suicide rate.
Right. So I'm thinking about it's kind of a two-pronged approach here about I'm thinking of what's the best kind of practical advice, A, for people that are feeling suicidal, and then B, for friends and relatives who suspect maybe somebody's feeling suicidal. So if we start with the friends and relatives, so people that maybe suspect somebody that they care about might be in that dark place. What can they do?
Ask them. So the really important message, I think, is that if you're worried about a friend or a loved one of some description, and you think they might be suicidal, I think what you need to do is be direct and ask them, obviously in a compassionate way, but ask them whether they're suicidal. It is a myth, and there's one of the myths when you were talking about myths earlier. Another myth is if I ask somebody about suicide, it plants the idea in their head. That's a complete myth. So that's not true. There's no evidence. But the best form of risk assessment is to ask somebody directly about their suicidal thoughts. And in our experience, most people, if they are in that dark place, are relieved that somebody has asked them. Because often there's shame around feeling suicidal, especially you mentioned that somebody's got a family or whatever, and well, how could you have these thoughts and so on? Whereas the best way is, so my advice is, if you're worried about somebody, please ask them. And the crucial thing is, if they do respond and say, yes, I'm suicidal, it's really vitally important that you ask them, that you respond in a compassionate, supportive way. But you're not a clinician usually, so it's a case of basically supporting them to seek help. So yes, I'm feeling suicidal, and then maybe encourage them to speak to somebody, a professional. That could be somebody from Samaritans or one of the other helplines, or it could be going to see your GP. And it's having those steps are really, really important. And then the other thing would be to try, and if the person is feeling suicidal and you're really, really worried about them, try and, don't hesitate, but in agreement with the person, is if they're going to be imminently at risk of killing themselves, it's really to 999 is always there in an emergency, and use it if required. But hopefully, in most cases, it'll be that by you speaking to them, it opens up a channel of communication, and that's vital.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about this when I was running through these questions, and one of the things that kind of occurred to me is that when you're actually going to ask somebody outright about this, I was thinking that there's probably a certain way that you could ask that's more likely to get an honest answer, and that's, like when you meet up with people and you say, oh, how are you doing? And the expected answer in a regular social situation is, I'm fine. Because if you turn around and say, oh, well, actually, I'm feeling pretty bad at the moment, it's just not the done thing. And I was thinking that maybe, if you sit down with someone and just say, are you okay at the minute? Is everything okay? And if they say, yeah, fine, it might not be the best to just take the word for it, and maybe you should go that one step further and not worry about being intrusive and just, I think, because the reason the other person's going to say no, the reason the other person's going to say, yeah, I'm fine, is because they don't want to burden you. And so I think it might be important for you to let the other person know that, look, if things aren't right, I really want to know. It's not a burden for me to know, so, are you okay? Is everything fine? Yeah, I'm fine. Like, no, really, because, I really care about you, and I'm sensing something's off. And if you need somebody to talk to, you know I'm here for you. Like, I want to share this with you. And I know it's tricky because it might be embarrassing for the person inquiring to take it that far. And especially I'm imagining, two blokes together kind of talking about this. But I think it might be important to push that little bit extra and really plant the seed in that person's mind. Look, I'm genuinely here for you. I'm not just asking. Like, I really want to know and I really want to help. So, I don't know if you think that's...
No, that's spot on. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Obviously, in each interaction, each friendship or whatever is different, and there's a bit of a judgment call. But I like what you're saying about, if you do think there's something wrong and you just think the first response was a stock automatic response, you're right to try and follow that up. And indeed, Samaritans have on their website, I think, good guidelines on, or good PDF document which talks about some of these issues and asks and gives you some suggestions about how you might broach the subject of being suicidal with a friend. So it might be worth having a look at that.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm actually supposed to be talking to somebody from the Samaritans very soon, so that's a nice little addendum. Right. So aside from asking somebody outright whether they're feeling that way, are there any kind of outward telltale signs to look for? Say something that separates somebody from who is, say, depressed but not suicidal from somebody who is suicidal?
Again, that's a good question. Obviously, the people who are suicidal do talk about being hopeless and being trapped. So I think that people who are talking along those lines, in which they are speaking in a way in which they can see no alternatives, and that maybe that obviously they're better off dead and they're a burden on others and they feel disconnected, those are the sorts of things that you're looking for somebody to say in communication and chat. But often they won't say that. So it is really, really difficult. So we know, in terms of, are the things that we know which are clear telltale signs? Yes, there are. There are changes in behaviour. We know people's changes in sleeping behaviour, eating behaviour, drinking behaviour, sexual behaviour. These things all change often, but they change in a lot of other cases as well. An example you gave there of somebody who was depressed but not suicidal. Obviously, there'll be changes in behaviour there. So there is no easy answer to say, actually, if they do this or say that, they're definitely more likely to kill themselves. Beyond the fact that we do know that people who do talk about being trapped and being hopeless and pessimistic for the future and see no alternatives, they're important markers and important telltale signs. And indeed, that's probably why we often are so direct and say, if you are worried about somebody, ask them outright. Ask them sensitively, but clearly, whether they've thought of killing themselves.
What about people who self-harm? Are those people more likely candidate, if that's the right word?
Well, people who self-harm are irrespective of their motive. So remember this complicated issue about the motives that underpin all forms of self-harm are complicated, and there's rarely a single motive. And so we talk about people who self-harm with suicidal intent and without suicidal intent. And that recognizes the fact that it is very, very difficult to determine whether somebody explicitly wanted to kill themselves. But if we just talk more generally about people who self-harm, and even if they say that they didn't want to kill themselves or they don't want to kill themselves whilst they're self-harming, you'll often find, first of all, that they are also at the same time having suicidal thoughts. And it's very, very common. And also we know that people who self-harm, even if they tell us that their self-harming is not to kill themselves, we know statistically they are more likely to die by suicide in the future.
This is a tricky one, but it's, again, in the context of advice for family and friends. If somebody is kind of confessing suicidal thoughts, is it ever appropriate to tell somebody else?
Well, the conversation should always be, if you're worried about somebody, our advice would always be that you say to the person, well, if I'm really, really worried about you, even if I think you're going to kill yourself, I'd have to tell somebody. Certainly in our research studies, albeit our research studies are confidential, we have an informed consent procedure, which is because many of the people we see will have been suicidal, may currently be suicidal, and we say to them that if we are really concerned about them and think they are at imminent risk of suicide, we'll try and get them, we'll talk to them about maybe speaking to a friend of theirs or a GP or a health worker who they may know, but that if all else fails and we're really worried about them, we will phone 999 to keep them safe. So I think more generally, when you're speaking to a friend, I would always err on the side of caution. And that if you think somebody's going to go out and kill themselves, I would do something about it, and I would seek professional support.
Yeah. Right. Well,
it's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I've got a couple of questions related to that, actually, before we move on to advice specifically for someone in crisis. So, if for somebody that confesses to being suicidal, right, I'm going to have to jump around a bit here because my head's all over the place thinking about this now. So if you're feeling suicidal, first of all, can that prove risky for somebody are they at risk of being sectioned? Are they at risk of maybe losing their children, things like that? Because I'm wondering if they're I'm guessing if somebody's feeling that way, worrying what the consequences of feeling that way might prove a barrier to seeking help. And I'm wondering if there are any risks involved in just the mere confession of it.
Well, of course there are risks because there's stigma around suicide, and in the UK there's the Mental Health Act, and which if a health professional is concerned about the safety of the individual, that they have a duty of care to ensure that person's kept safe, and that might be sort of mandatory referral to hospital. So that is obviously a real issue. But I suppose for me, it's the primary thing is to keep the person safe, and that we know that when somebody's acutely suicidal, they can't see alternatives. They don't think things will ever change, and that it's very difficult to see how their life could be any different. And I suppose what all of us should be trying to do is, at that moment in which the person's acutely in crisis, we want to keep them as safe as possible. And there's different ways in which you can do that. And as a friend, that might be just making sure, staying with them when they're acutely suicidal until they maybe get the professional help. Because I think the key thing is, if you're a friend and somebody discloses that they're suicidal, 9 times out of 10, the person they disclose it to will not be a suicide expert or a mental health professional necessarily, if it's to a friend. And that it's always recognizing that if you're a friend, that seek help, speak to their GPs, or try to get their permission to speak to their GP, or to phone somebody else who could help them.
I just wonder if there's a bit of a paradox there for the person actually feeling suicidal, that if they worry that by telling somebody and by seeking help, it won't help, it'll actually make things worse because they worry about how they might be treated by the system.
Well, I mean that's why we need to continue to challenge mental health stigma and recognise most cases that does not happen and the person gets the support that they require. So, albeit I understand the sort of so-called paradox of the risk, but for me, it's better off that the person is alive rather than kills himself.
Yeah. Right. So, okay. So now, if we kind of get into advice for somebody if they're feeling this way, my first question, I suppose, relates to, say, therapy. So, I mean, we've already covered plenty of times that, just reaching out to somebody and seeking help, but I'm thinking now more about actually trying to rewind the process a bit. So, what's the most effective therapy? I know things like dialectical behavioural therapy is one that's specifically targeted to people with suicidal feelings.
Yeah.
Do you know research-wise if there's a particular therapy that somebody should seek out if they've reached that point, as opposed to, say, regular CBT?
So, no. So the issue is there is evidence for dialectical behaviour therapy. There is evidence for cognitive behaviour therapy. There's some evidence for mindfulness with people who are depressed and have a history of suicide attempts. And the question is working out what intervention or what therapy fits the profile of the individual. And I suppose that, so for example, dialectical behaviour therapy has historically been developed for people with borderline personality disorder. The CBT is more generally in mental health presentations more generally. So I would seek professional help. If you're somebody who's feeling suicidal, speak to your GP, get a referral, hopefully to speak to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and then discuss the options available. Because the other issue is that it's not all of the therapies or treatments are available everywhere, and that's obviously a challenge. And it isn't, so there is no one size fits all. But the key message is try to continue to engage, and hopefully you'll find a therapy which will work for you.
Do we know if I suppose it has to be a UK specific question, but if somebody's reached that point, one of the big things, one of the big problems with the mental health system is the long waiting lists.
Yeah.
If you've reached a point where you are feeling suicidal, will that put you on a fast track to receiving treatment?
I mean, I don't know that. I mean, I'm an academic, not a clinician, so that's not really a question for me to answer.
Right.
But obviously, the more acute one is in terms of risk or well-being, I would like to think that they would be prioritised. But over when there are scarce resources. But as I say, it's not for me to respond to that one.
Okay, well, I'll try and find out the exact procedure on that and include that in the show notes.
Yeah.
If somebody's been, feels like a bit of a stupid question this, but I don't know if, I'll throw it out there anyway. If somebody's been suicidal in the past and they've recovered and they're worried about getting there in the future, they kind of want to preempt future episodes, and I suppose this might work for like friends and family as well. Is there a preemptive sort of safety kit that someone can put together, or a protocol that somebody can?
Well, one of the things which has been developed in the United States actually, and we're doing some work on just starting here in Scotland, is the whole notion of safety planning. And what a safety plan is you work with the person who's been suicidal and identify the sort of triggering situations that makes them maybe more likely to be suicidal again in the future. And you work at a plan of action of maybe who you might phone the next time you're feeling suicidal or concerned about yourself. You would also have helpline numbers. You would have strategies which you may think about, or coping strategies which were helpful in the past. And so you sort of develop that, and it's pretty straightforward. And the thing is, it's something to sort of keep with you or have in your mind's eye the next time you're in crisis. So there's safety plans out there. And again, There's no randomized clinical trial data yet on how effective they are or not. But as I say, one of the things we're doing, we're just starting this study in the UK, which is trying to see does safety planning plus telephone support in the weeks following a suicide attempt, does that reduce the likelihood that a person will attempt suicide again in the future?
Well, yeah, speaking of which, that this kind of closing question is, if somebody's, like, what's the prognosis? If somebody's attempted suicide before, what's their likelihood of getting better? And do we know the difference between somebody that's felt suicidal, hasn't attempted, and whether it's different for somebody who has gone on to attempt it, whether the prognosis is different for those two?
Well, the answer to your first part of the question about, in general, prognosis for people who've attempted suicide, the overwhelming majority of people who attempt suicide will make a complete recovery, will never attempt suicide again, and never die by suicide. It's probably in the region of about between 5 and 10% of people who have attempted suicide who will basically maybe die by suicide, not even that in the future. So it's a very, very small risk, statistical risk, obviously, but it's an important risk. In terms of the differences between people who think about suicide and people who attempt suicide, most people who have thoughts of suicide, again, will never attempt suicide. And so their prognosis is better and they'll never attempt in the first place. But I suppose my message is a message of optimism, which is the overwhelming majority of people will not, who have suicidal thoughts, will never act on those thoughts. And even amongst those who attempt suicide, usually if they receive treatment or support, that their risk of attempting suicide in the future is really quite low. Statistically, it's still there, obviously, but in terms of real numbers, most people won't.
Okay, right. So I'm gonna subject you to my quickfire questions, like I do everybody, in a minute. But I've got a couple of extra ones I kind of want to throw on. I didn't quite know where these would fit. Well, the first one is, as somebody who engages with the media on this topic, is there anything I've missed out of this interview, or anything that gets missed out of the interviews you do in general, where you think, I wish people had asked about this, but they don't? Maybe an important aspect of your research that isn't being recognised or needs to be more well known?
Well, no. I think the media has improved markedly in the last 20 years in its coverage of suicide and mental health more generally. I suppose a specific point, though, which is important to recognise, is that the way we make progress in understanding mental health and suicide and its prevention is by doing the research. And the sad reality is mental health research and suicide prevention research in particular is acutely underfunded. And I suppose we all have a duty in which we need to try and understand, or we need to make sure we raise the profile of the importance of research. So I suppose that's my message, or my plea is, the next time you're thinking about, or somebody's thinking about doing a marathon or a 10K for charity, consider using hopefully your great efforts to raise money for a mental health charity or a suicide research charity. Okay.
You said at the beginning of this interview that you felt like a failure because you wasn't able to save the lives of your a friend and mentor who took their own lives. Mm-hmm. Has that sense of responsibility, has that increased now that your responsibility and reputation as a leader in this field has increased? And also, if so, how do you deal with that emotionally? I imagine it's a very emotive topic to research.
Well, I mean, I don't, in terms of the first part of that question, I mean, it's irrespective of my reputation. It's just that somebody who's worked in this area and is so passionate about it, obviously, in some ways, it was probably inevitable that that may happen to me. But no, it's more the fact that it highlighted to me the scale of the challenge, and obviously it was just such a personal loss. In particular, my close friend who and we discussed her being suicidal in the past, and so it was just the futility. I just think it's such a waste of a life because she was such an amazing person. Like obviously, lots and lots of people are, but I can only speak personally. So it's more that why couldn't I have done more? And then what was the second part of your question?
Like, how do you deal with this? Deal with it emotionally, because I imagine you feel, like whatever research you're involved in your CBT therapist or whatever, and you feel responsible for the people you're looking out for. I imagine this is particularly tricky, maybe, to deal with.
Well, no, for me, obviously the research that we do, I obviously work as part of a team, and because you're continually thinking about suicide, that obviously is an emotional load, and that. And also I have a responsibility for my team to ensure that they're now in the front line and seeing people who are suicidal a lot. And so it's keeping my mental health obviously protected, but crucially is keeping their mental health protected. And the key thing for us is debriefing and talking. And we have a pretty open policy of always talking and trying to look out for each other. And if there is a tricky situation, is that obviously I try and engage with them, and similarly, I'll always speak to peers and mentors that I know, and to keep my mental health good.
Do you feel like progress is being made in this field? And I don't just mean in like the conceptual understanding of suicide, but I mean in actual like prevention and having like a real world effect.
Oh, absolutely. I think that. Although that if you look across the world, the suicide rates have remained stubbornly stable, there have been decreases, for example, in Scotland, of about 20% in the last 10 or so years. And I think that's all positive. So there have been advances. I think for me, what I think has been a fantastic development is that we're now routinely involving people who have lived experience, people who have attempted suicide, people who have lost loved ones to suicide. They're now routinely involved in the research process, and their voice is being heard. So I'm absolutely delighted with that, because I think not one of us, and doesn't matter your background or your specialty or how long you've been working in the field, not one of us have all the answers. And the great thing is this field really is interdisciplinary, and it brings together different backgrounds in terms of scientific backgrounds, but also those, as I say, with lived experience, different sorts of lived experience, because it's only through working together with them and policymakers and other clinicians at the front line that we really will drive the suicide rate down.
Okay. Right, Rory, let's lift the mood now with the quickfire questions. Okay. Firstly, do you have any book recommendations, either on this topic or anything else you feel would be of value to the listeners?
Kay Redfield Jamieson's book called Touched by Fire. And Kay Redfield Jamieson is a psychiatrist in the United States who has bipolar disorder and was suicidal in the past. And it's just a brilliant read, absolutely fantastically, really insightful, really moving read. Okay. No, actually, I just said it's not. That's her other book, Touched by Fire. Oh, go on. Her first book, it's her first, which is the autobiographical one, which is An Unquiet Mind. I think that's what it's called. Oh, yeah, we've had that one recommended before, so it must be a good one. Yes. I'll stick both those in the show notes. If you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health, what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public? To have the largest impact, I would really ensure that they had embedded properly mental health and well-being in the curriculum, not as a sort of adjunct or as a tick box, but really, really central core element of the curriculum. If you could have unlimited funding to research anything you liked, however niche, however bizarre, what would it be and why? Well, it'll be obviously something on suicide and its prevention. Probably a large scale intervention, a psychological intervention yet to be developed, but that you would have unlimited money or not unlimited, but you would have such sufficient amounts of money to deliver it on such a large scale that not only would you be able to work out whether it was effective in reducing risk of suicide, but you'd be able to work out who it worked for and why, because even though there have been these advances in sort of psychological therapies and psychosocial therapies or interventions, often, and even when they work, we don't know whether they work for men better than women, or whether they work for older people versus the younger people, or people from more disadvantaged backgrounds versus more affluent, and lots of other permutations. So if I had unlimited money, I'd be able to do that.
What, if anything, keeps you up at night?
Work, research, my kids, worrying about my kids, but in a good way usually. But no, work usually. Deadlines. I've always got competing deadlines, and it's usually how do I juggle whatever other deadlines so I keep as many people happy as possible.
What's the best piece of life advice anyone's ever given you?
That's a good question. Be less hard on yourself. That's probably the best piece of advice I've ever been given. And you don't have to be perfect. Nobody is. Accept who you are and love who you are, failings and all.
What mistakes do you continue to make despite knowing better?
I continually say yes to things which I probably should say no to because I don't have the time.
Was that a subliminal dig?
No, it wasn't.
Okay, final three. What part of your career are you most proud of?
I haven't really thought about my career in terms of being proud of.
Probably should.
I was really proud of getting my PhD in the first instance on suicide. So I'm just really pleased, I suppose, I've been able to develop a group on a lab around suicide research, which brings through or mentors, hopefully, the next generation of suicide researchers. Probably that would be my proudest thing, which is doing that, mentoring the next generation.
Okay. Outside of family and academia, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
Outside of family money, well, probably the thing I get most joy out of, as well as the most frustration, is playing tennis.
Okay.
I absolutely love it. I'm not particularly good, but I'll try really hard.
Okay, final one. The big one. What do you think is the key to happiness?
Well, that's related to maybe the best piece of advice I was given. I don't know. It's hard to. I don't know what happiness is, obviously, but I suppose my interpretation of it is just be in the moment more. Just try to be more present in the moment when you're doing things, rather than we spend so much of our time being concerned about what's going to happen in the future, and also ruminating about what has happened in the past. Whereas if we just spent more time in the everyday moment, I think brings me a lot of happiness. Okay,
Rory, is there any links you'd like to direct the listeners towards? And are you on social media?
Well, if you track the link, obviously, to our website and suicideresearch.info, and then obviously we've got a Facebook page and I've got a Twitter account. So those, and then because obviously the link to our homepage will latest news in our lab and stuff is all covered there.
Okay. Well, I'll include all the links anyway in the show notes for people to go straight there.
And then also obviously have helplines listed.
Oh, of course, will do, definitely, yes.
The Samaritans and so on.
Yeah. Okay, Rory O'Connor, thank you very much.
Okay, Danny, good luck. Cheers, all the best.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode and you've got a couple of minutes to spare, then maybe you'd consider leaving us a positive review on iTunes or Stitcher or whichever podcast service you happen to use. That'd be greatly appreciated. It also encourages other people to give us a listen. If you can't spare a couple of minutes, but you've got a couple of seconds, maybe you could share one of our episodes with your family or friends on social media. Don't forget you can comment on any of these episodes by going to myownworstenemy.org/podcast. And if you'd like to contact me, you can email me at danny@myownworstenemy.org. Or if email's a bit old-fashioned for you, then you can get hold of me on all the different social media channels at Danny D. Whitaker. And that's about that. I'll see you again next time.